Spears with Hannah Becker. Today's conversation promises to be an insightful one with a remarkable guest. Whether you're joining us for the first time or you're a regular listener, I'm so glad you're here. My goal is to bring you closer to the innovative leaders and thinkers shaping our future. And today I am thrilled to welcome General William Bender. General Bender is a seasoned board member, tech industry executive, former Air Force CIO, and retired three-star general with extensive expertise in IT, cybersecurity, and governance. As CIO, he oversaw a $17 billion IT spend and a 54,000-person workforce. At Leidos, his leadership of government relations and customer account management supported growth from $10 billion to $15 billion. An innovation driver, General Bender is also an experienced board member, advisor to startups, and a published writer and speaker. As a prominent technology leader, he currently serves on multiple boards, including Tangram Flex, GrammaTech, Anametric, Vislink, and formerly served as board chair for AFCEA International. He is a strategic growth advisor to Keeper Technology, focused on data management storage solutions, to IT Cadre, focused on enterprise data visualization, and numerous other data-centric and cybersecurity companies. He is a principal with Deepwater Point and Associates, providing consulting services and thought leadership. He held a distinguished career in defense and technology. As SVP at Leidos, he led customer-facing business development, supporting defense, intelligence, civilian, and health sectors. His leadership supported the growth of Leidos revenue to over $15 billion. He established a company-wide account management program and implemented the Leidos Technology Exchange, enhancing customer engagement. And as CIO of the Air Force, he's spearheaded IT modernization and cybersecurity, establishing the first roles for CISO, CDO, and Chief Innovation Officer within the Department of Defense. He also envisioned a first-of-its-kind initiative to leverage the Silicon Valley entrepreneurial and innovation ecosystem, establishing the Air Force Innovation Unit, which led to today's Defense Innovation Unit with the Office of the Secretary of Defense. He also developed key initiatives like Agile Software Factory and the Air Force's Cloud-First strategy. As an Air Force officer, he served as Deputy Chief at the Office of Security Cooperation in Baghdad, leading the development and implementation of foreign military sales to Iraq. He served as commander of the United States Air Force Expeditionary Center and dual-hatted as AMC-numbered Air Force commander, responsible for all operations of sustainment. He also led communications, training, and global deployment efforts for 21,000 personnel. Throughout his distinguished military career, he held multiple global leadership roles, including Director of Warfighting Integration and as commander of the 86th Airlift Wing. He has also held key positions on various executive boards, including AT&T, Leidos, Samsung, Sequence, Syntec, Anium, Dun Bradstreet, and Brown University. He's an accomplished speaker and award recipient, recognized for his contributions to information technology and defense, holding degrees and certifications from prestigious institutions like Harvard Kennedy School, the Center for Creative Leadership, Army War College, Embry-Riddle Aeronautical University, and Manhattan College. Well, welcome to Tipping Spears, General Bender.
It is great to be with you today, Hannah. Thank you for having me.
Yeah, I've been looking forward to this. So can you start us off today by telling us where your story begins? We got the outstanding resume. Now I'm curious as to how all this got started.
Well, I actually like this question to start out because it's a softball. I don't know that I could get anything wrong, but thank you again for having me today and for the opportunity to, just share some thoughts with you throughout the time that we have together. In terms of where my story begins, I think probably like just about everybody else, where were you born? What was, your formative years, and how did you end up, sort of launching off of those experiences as a young person through, the earliest years and your time with, family and your memories and all of that. How did that lead to, sort of the career you've had and what you're doing, even today? And for me, it was, very simply, a good, solid family where, a strong work ethic was, always important. I mean, I watched my dad religiously leave every morning at 7 a.m., jump in the carpool, come home at 5, and wash, rinse, repeat. So he had a regular cadence around working in a job that certainly provided for our family, put truth behind the notion that in those times, I think every set of parents was trying to make life a little bit better for their children by making sure they sent them to school. And in our case, six kids all off to a college education and opportunities that we would have never imagined for ourselves. So starts with the family, and truthfully, a lot of good fortune and right place, right time that always feeds into it. But I think a strong work ethic and a notion of doing the right thing for the right reasons, started with my family and in particular with my dad and my mom. So I hope that's a good way to get this started.
That is. We can definitely see how that foundation was laid.
Yeah.
So, what sparked your interest in serving in the military? Is joining the Air Force something you grew up always wanting to do, or was there kind of a story behind that?
Well, I had an uncle who I just admired tremendously. He had a career in the Air Force and was, an aviator. And through our, growing up, we periodically would visit them at the base that he was assigned to. And he saw fit to get us, young kids out to see the airplanes. And I was just completely taken by the whole idea of, flying airplanes and all of that. That said, I didn't necessarily have an idea of how I would, get to do that someday. And my older brother, when we started to talk about, what am I going to do when I grow up? He had a notion of, well, wouldn't it be, cool to be like Uncle Dave and fly in airplanes? And the more I looked into it, I realized that a way that I could do that would be to join the Air Force, go through college on an ROTC program, and hopefully, if things worked out, get a pilot aviator slot, which, as good fortune had it, that's exactly what worked out for me. And so I went to Manhattan College on an ROTC scholarship, initially as an engineer, and then eventually was able to change that to a pilot scholarship, which was important to me because it was the only way I could afford to go away to a private school.
Mhm.
And, the rest is history. I joined the Air Force commissioning in 1985, I guess it would be. And when I graduated from school and went to pilot training, and, that just one thing led to the next. And over a 34-year career, I actually had 23 different assignments. So a great variety of different experiences, all of which, you couldn't pay me enough to have had, and none of it was planned, but it was just a very rich and rewarding time in the military.
So, was there a particular event or person that served as a catalyst for your career?
Well, I mentioned, my Uncle Dave in terms
Mhm.
of initial interest in aviation for sure. But beyond that, it was the people that I met. And there's one thing to make a decision to give it a try
Mhm.
and, to accept an ROTC scholarship, knowing that you were going to have some commitment back to the Air Force. But then it was the people that you met along the way, and in everything from my professor of aerospace studies to my initial squadron commander, and of course the people that you got to work with and fly with day in and day out. To a person, I respected them, admired them, found them that I could take them at their word, and just liked being a part of something that was bigger than myself. And so, not a single catalyst, but numerous catalysts throughout a career at really every level. Certainly as a junior officer, somebody that I could emulate their leadership or follow their lead. That's one piece of it. But then finding people that are uniquely capable in one way or another, and joining ranks with them to make something better at your organization or whatever. Just it was, sort of catalyzed throughout a career. The further I went, the more I was energized by it and felt like I was a part of something much bigger than myself, and that I actually, over time, would be in a position, of influence to actually make it better and to leave it better than I found it, that kind of thing. So that happened throughout my career, which was, as I said, very diverse in its experiences, a lot of time overseas, a lot of different airplanes that I flew. I ended up flying 21 different aircraft with pilot and command time. So a lot of moving around, a lot of different experiences, and in every case just felt, how lucky am I to be a part of something so rich.
I know, every career journey has its hurdles. Can you tell us what some of the biggest obstacles were that you faced in your career and how you overcame them?
Well, I think that probably goes again, like some of these other, questions in multiple different directions all at
Mhm.
once. I think that, a good example would be, for all of the good examples of leadership, there were times that you bumped up against somebody that you didn't necessarily fully respect the way that they were handling a given situation or running the organization that you were in, or the way that they might, comport themselves day in and day out as a formal leader. And, so that was, could have been a hurdle, but instead I tried to use it as a learning experience in terms of my own leadership development. You learn just as much from those who you maybe wouldn't emulate, but you certainly learn that that's out there and what not to do, that kind of thing. Similarly, I think, all of these various assignments, not all of them were premium assignments, not to, great locations, and maybe more or less a sacrifice for your family. But
Mhm.
every one of them was a rich experience when you allowed to, sort of integrate it into the larger fabric of the career that you were building. And so rather than, look at it as a challenge because your kids were changing schools again, or your wife, wasn't able to pick up her employment, instead you looked at it as, sort of just another part of a long Air Force career and a long military career, not unique to the Air Force, that, you know, um, challenges come your way, and you're stronger for overcoming them. And you're doing it not alone, but with others that are both, friends and family that you hold dear and are close with. And so, it builds for that at the end of your career, you look back and you say, I wouldn't have changed a thing. And so, hurdles in the moment, but really opportunities to overcome and to grow in the long run.
Yeah, it's a great perspective, General Bender. I think that's very applicable to everyone in the audience. So you served as CIO of the Air Force during a very pivotal time of war and innovation. Can you tell us about your time as a CIO and, lessons learned from that experience?
Yeah, I think my initial reflections on the time now, that was 2014 that I was coming into the job, and my immediate prior job was in as the deputy commander in Iraq, which was
Mhm.
a very, very difficult time. This is when ISIS was looming, and some of the challenges associated with the security at the American embassy in Iraq in Baghdad was being challenged. And so I was there during a really, precarious time where security wasn't guaranteed and
Mhm.
challenges were many. And meantime, it's a 1 year assignment, so I'm looking for where do I go next and what does the Air Force have in mind. And the chief of staff actually got on the phone with me, and he said, we're going to make you the chief information officer of the Air Force. And I didn't know much about it, but I knew, that I would be much better off if I was a technical aficionado and had a mastery of, sort of the skills and aptitudes that would be important to be in a successful CIO. And, probably more transparent than I needed to be, I told him that I could barely find the on-off switch of my computer, and that I was not that person. And he quickly changed my thinking around the role that I was going into and said that it's far more a leadership position, one that's driving transformational change and that needs to think across the larger Air Force in running the business of the Air Force, where information technology was ubiquitous to everything we were doing across the global Air Force, where the cyberspace domain was rapidly becoming operationalized and new to the Air Force, and we needed leadership there, and a whole host of other challenges that were in front of the Air Force and the other military services within the Department of War, um, that were going to require transformational change. And without going into each and every one of them, it meant, um, starting to get serious, as I said, about cybersecurity, starting to transition from a hardware to a software centric Air Force, understanding the importance of data to, sort of on the leading edge of where we are today with artificial intelligence, and understanding that in large measure it's the data that we own that is going to be giving us better decisions inside of the adversary's decision cycle and things of that nature. And so he assured me that it was really around managing and leading transformational change for the Air Force. And that's exactly how I found it to be. But my initial inkling was around, it's all about the technology, and I don't have the requisite background. I found very quickly that you can hire technical people, and in fact, I did a lot of that. I found experts in various disciplines within these areas that I talked about. Meanwhile, I was overseeing all of it and keeping a vision for where do we want to take the Air Force, you know, why is it important to the operator and the warfighter, how it all comes together in the field, and that it needs to work in a way that is operationally sound and that will, sort of put the Air Force in a position to remain competitive and to win the next war and that kind of thing. So kind of high level thoughts, but a recognition that, sort of all of the work we were doing internal to the Air Force within the CIO and the communications and information and cyber functional was really around delivering better outcomes and mission success to the operators out and across the Air Force, where, as I said earlier, IT was, sort of the underpinnings to that success. Whether we thought of it in those terms or not, that was the reality, and even more so today, where you're highly dependent on the cyberspace domain, both offensively and defensively, not purely for cyber purposes, but just simply to make sure that we can fight and win the nation's wars.
So, General Bender, I know you help stand up, new organizations and roles that really change, how the military and then the Air Force operated. People, don't always like or embrace change, even when it's necessary. How were you able to lead innovation in large bureaucratic organization, such as the Air Force?
I think it was one of the first questions I asked myself because it was overwhelming when I got to the Air Staff in this role without really any experience as a three-star general and operating as part of the so-called Air Force three C-suite, where I had a seat at the table on the Air Force Council and was, you know, expected to drive this transformational change that I alluded to earlier, how exactly does that get done in what was, and probably remains today, a stifling bureaucracy, the largest bureaucracy in the world, if you think of it in terms of the Department of Defense or the Department of War. And you start to realize that I can only do what I can actually influence. And so, in a way, if you can imagine sort of putting a box around those areas that I could actually influence, whether it was through policy and governance or through resourcing, uh, whether it was, decisions around major initiatives for the Air Force. As I said, operationalizing the cyberspace domain would have been one of them. I stood up a year-long, uh, we called it a cybersecurity task force, but it ended up being the Chief Information Security Office of the Air Force, for which we had to that point not had one. And it was an all of Air Force effort where every voice was heard, but it was basically collectively getting the Air Force around a single understanding of the challenges in front of us, both securing our enterprise, but also operating within it when, a new warfighting domain had happened upon us where we weren't necessarily fully cognizant of it until we find ourselves in it, and now we have to operate. Um, there were other areas I alluded to going from primarily outfitting units with hardware, buying kit and fielded systems that had a long, history of, sort of being how you were resourcing to taking a different approach and almost software defined everything. Could be much more effective and efficient in kind of harnessing that ability where technology had taken us to agile software development. And so I stood up an all of Air Force approach to software development, which ultimately led to at one point 34 different software factories that were by and large creating agile software development efforts and modernizing the Air Force as a byproduct of what they were doing. There were other efforts around innovation that you alluded to. The Air Force Innovation Unit was a recognition that the Air Force didn't have the requisite skills and innovation internal to the Air Force, that we would have to better leverage industry and some of the work that was taking place in the innovation ecosystem in Silicon Valley and other areas throughout the country. And so it was a measured effort to harness that through relationship building with, in my case, with Silicon Valley, and convincing some of the venture capital folks and even the Air Force, internal to the Air Force, to start to develop an internal Air Force uh, effort inside of that innovation ecosystem that we could then further leverage. And that came in super handy over time. As you also mentioned, that ended up being the initial plug, if you will, for the Defense Innovation Unit, which today is extremely effective and very much central to some of the innovation that's happening across the Department of War as a result of, kind of leveraging innovation across the wider federal government and in particular in the defense space. And so all of these initiatives were kind of coming to a head at once, and it recognized what could I actually influence and what could I do to be the initial seed and then maybe to till the soil to set the conditions for a sustained growth in these areas where I knew that my assignment as a CIO was not going to last forever. It might be a 3-year or 4-year assignment, but it was really an initial start down the road to transformational change, which was not going to happen and be concluded in my time in the seat, but would take place over multiple iterations of the chief information officer and other senior leaders across the functional Air Force. So it was really, I think, the lessons learned were one of which was influence what you can influence, build relationships that you can trust, um, go outside of your own ability and bring in other senior leaders. In some ways, I saw myself as the chief education officer of my peer group, and including all the way up to the secretary and the chief, to tell them why what we were doing was important, why transformational change was required, and to, fight the good fight in the budget battles to get the resources that were necessary. You had to be pretty compelling because there were many requirements of many of these other functionals. And so, convincing others that your requirements were important to their success ultimately was a part of it as well. And so a long answer to a rather straightforward question, but it really touched on multiple different aspects. And I think that the most important was what could I honestly influence from my organization and allow others, to at the boundary of that organization see it firsthand and make a choice to do the same for their organizations.
And I appreciate your emphasis on kind of the what you can influence and the boundaries, the feasibility. It's very grounded in reality, which I think when a lot of folks try to lead change, it's, the pie in the sky and then it's a lot of disappointment. So that's a great framework for folks to approach these scenarios with. So I know the current operating environment is very dynamic, very complex. What advice do you have for people who are trying to get things done, in an environment like this, one that's very filled with uncertainty?
Yeah, I think, that's a great question, and there is a ton of uncertainty. A lot of it is driven by the external environment, where almost on a daily basis, technology is changing, and things like um, artificial intelligence are, we're on one day we're on the leading edge of the wave, and then we're overcome by it, and uh, the prognosticators, if you will, talk in terms of it's only going to grow from here, and we have to, get our hands around or our arms around it. But we're probably late to need, and lots of change within sort of the government writ large that is driving new priorities and new requirements and things of this nature. So getting used to the fact that it's a very dynamic environment, one could become overwhelmed by it. As I mentioned, when I got to the CIO role, it's only gotten faster and more complex since then. So my, sort of advice in this area, hearkening off my own experiences, is really be discerning about what can, like what is your role, what are your roles and responsibilities that are, both necessary and impactful, and don't bite off more than you can take on. Instead, be very laser focused on the, two or three or maybe four priorities. I remember when I went to the CIO job, I was very circumspect and sort of developing a charter or it's probably too much to say a manifesto, but these are the things I'm going to do in the 3 years that I'm in the seat. And they are, all around, look at data as a, sort of as a, as a strategic aspect for the Air Force, start to transition to software, take advantage of the cloud, and at some point developed a cloud first strategy that I had to coordinate across the whole Air Force. But it was at the very earliest stages of taking advantage of cloud instead of feeling like we had to have on-prem data servers and everything else, and the cost associated with that. And then, the fourth was a very practical one, like pay attention to the Air Force that we have and keep the lights on and make sure that you're properly resourcing it, both in terms of trained individuals, but also, technology that was going to be make sure that you could win, the fight if you find yourself in it tonight. And so with those four thematics, everything that I did in my 3 years was around, if it didn't fit in those four, then it may be important work and it was still going to get done. But my perspective was it probably didn't need my attention and that of my deputy and the principals within my organization. So being thoughtful in the choices that you make in a very dynamic and complex environment was critically important to actually getting stuff done. And as I said, I think the speed of the environment changing and the dynamism of that environment has only gotten greater and more uncertain. So it speaks to even greater importance placed on, making those choices. And it has to be done in collaboration. Like teaming has become more and more important because nobody owns everything in the dynamic environment that we have today. And so it's looking to your left and to your right and assessing who are the stakeholders that have equities in this area that could be trusted and counted upon to work with me closely in order to achieve something in the interest of the larger Air Force where everybody wins. And making those choices and assessing those stakeholders and bringing them into, sort of a coalition of the willing is not light work. It's critically important, but it's really the only way you can get stuff done. Almost impossible to imagine that you own anything in today's world outright. And instead, it's really the team that you build and the people that you work with and the trust that you develop to actually get stuff done.
Yeah, that's excellent advice for folks that feel kind of caught up in the riptide of change here lately. So you had a very successful career in the military and then also in the private sector with Leidos, Deepwater, and several others. Can you provide insights or advice for people who are looking for ways to continue serving our nation in the private sector?
Yeah, in the case, sure, that's a great question and one that I've thought quite a bit about because what I'm doing today in terms of board and advisory work, probably in an honest self-assessment would not have been possible if it weren't for the combination of a long military career and a focus on, the operational Air Force while I, took on different roles throughout, the Air Force and especially in the back half of my career where I was leading large organizations and driving transformational change. But it was the combination of that experience and then taking it, sort of across the transom to industry where the dependencies on by government on industries have grown so tremendously in the last, couple of decades to the point today that there's, virtually no way to do what we have to do within the military without a high reliance, almost in some cases, a total reliance on industry to not just deliver the capabilities in the form of, hardware and software and solutions, but also a shared responsibility um, to handle very complex and difficult national security issues or defense issues in partnership, in full partnership with making choices internal to industry. Where are they going to spend their internal research and development dollars? How are we going to contract with industry, again, in the area of research and development to develop, over the horizon capabilities that are going to be fit for purpose in a world that we're going to, not necessarily the world that we came from. And how are we going to harness all of the inherent capability within industry to develop winning solutions and capabilities and technologies for a world that is, as we talked about in the last discussion, so uncertain and so dynamic where you can't necessarily predict the future. And so keeping those capabilities to the degree that's possible in an open fashion, in a plug and play where you can iteratively develop, improve capabilities that are up to the challenge of an environment that maybe you didn't even foresee or couldn't have forecasted just a couple of years ago. So that just speaks to locking arms between industry and government in a way that I felt like coming from government made me much more effective in my executive role at Leidos, where I was uh, running a team that was really responsible for being the eyes and ears for industry and the voice of reason for government in developing that partnership between the two that was trusted in, that was working together on sort of a single vision for where we wanted to go because it was so critical to keeping America's, national security and our defense forces strong. And, I think I was in a time that was still developing, but becoming crystal clear that there wasn't the capacity or the resources or the trained individuals within the military because it had shrunk to the point that would not be up for the task of doing it all themselves, and that there was this higher dependency, almost a full dependency and reliance on industry in order to be successful. And so I kind of lived on both sides of that transom, recognized it as the CIO of the Air Force, increased my relationships with industry, and then grew those relationships and strengthened them as part of industry to even drive industry to industry or business to business partnerships, recognizing that it was going to take many perspectives and lots of resources co-joined, if you would, around solving problems for the government that they were not able to solve just for themselves, but instead would have to solve in partnership with industry. So, I think that for people who are looking to uh, at some point transition into the private sector, first and foremost, you can continue the long developed, desire to do work that is, sort of larger than yourself because it's actually contributing to the national security of the country. And it doesn't even have to at this point, it doesn't even have to be in a government contractor role. It may be in commercial industry where there's an increasing reliance on commercial solutions for defense purposes. We see that growing by orders of magnitude. And so understanding the roles that you can play in industry and in different for-profit and nonprofit positions, all looking to partner with government in order to make sure that they're successful in the future, seems to me a very, sort of reasonable way to look at your continued service, even if it's no longer in uniform, but instead in a role in industry.
Yeah, one of the things I found so fascinating about your career was, you know, military service, private industry, and then being, at the helm of nonprofit organizations like AFCEA. You kind of hit all the sectors. I feel like you understand all the players there. So it's a great perspective.
Yeah, and like that's a great point. While I was at Leidos, I was very fortunate to work for a company that allowed that continued strengthening of partnerships and relationships. And so not only did I chair the board at AFCEA, but was, participating in a number of, trade associations
Mhm.
or professional networks that, generally speaking, were focused from the lapel pin I wore, which is
Mhm.
Leidos, was how can I further enhance our relationships as one of many industry providers to a larger network of those who are also in industry and even in nonprofit organizations who all had the same goals and objectives, which was to keep our national security first and foremost and to help the government navigate some very challenging times around, you know, um, a period where the dynamic nature of the environment was changing in some cases overnight. How were they going to remain successful if not for sort of a coalition of the willing among, sort of the for-profit, the nonprofits, and the trade associations, and even academia. So I was in a position at Leidos to, you know, foster those relationships, facilitate, strengthen partnerships with all of the, contributing factors there, the stakeholders, and felt that that was critically important. And it's even more so today, 2 years after I've left Leidos and I'm out on my own.
I know there's been, a lot of discussion around the need for more industry and government collaboration, especially when it comes to new technologies, because things are changing so fast. And we need the right capabilities for the fight of tomorrow. So that's a great objective, but as you know, it's much more difficult to actually put into practice. Can you share your thoughts on how, this might work and what institutional challenges or barriers must be overcome to make those collaborations, a reality?
I think in terms of it's a top-down and a bottoms-up perspective that will be required of all of the various stakeholders. So this is true in government, in academia, in some of our, sort of renowned research and development hubs, in our innovation hubs. So think in terms of Silicon Valley or Austin or some of the, up in Boston. There's plenty of innovation taking place out primarily, resourced by industry. And even just in some of our more traditional industry partners, whether like at Leidos, they were primarily focused on complex systems of systems integrations and collaboration around very large, complex solutioning, or even some of the platform companies, major weapon system development efforts and things of that nature. In every case, there has to be a commitment from the top down, so CEO level, formal leader level, to really focus on partnership and collaboration um, outside of the bounds of their own organization. So that would be industry with government, industry with academia, and that happens to varying levels. But you really need to put that on steroids. And then probably far more importantly is actually a culture internal to your organization where you are fostering teaming efforts, a whole of, sort of an enterprise approach to what you're being asked to do. So, I'll go back to my time in uniform as the CIO. I had very specific functional responsibilities internal to that organization and tried to foster and facilitate an above board, sort of an all of CIO and all of A6 approach to them because the failure to do so also meant that when it came to the field, you would have, training systems that were unsupportable or networks that were unsustainable because the funding hadn't been, laid in over, the years to come, or, less than effective mission systems because it wasn't thoughtfully designed across all of the various organizations internal. And there's a parallel for that in industry, different business units that are incentivized in some cases counter to facilitating, partnership across different stovepipes of excellence within the company. And so, you know, my perspective was one that was, we have to put the premium on teaming and partnership. I will go to the mat in trying to facilitate that. One of the initiatives that I stood up at Leidos was called the Customer Technology Exchange, and it was a recognition that multiple customers were interested in, some of the offerings that Leidos or the technology development efforts that Leidos was undertaking, and that we didn't have to arbitrarily treat them as, separate entities inside of the Department of Defense or even in the Fourth Estate. So, come one, come all, look at this, overlay it with your specific requirements, and take a more enterprise approach to our business development efforts where multiple different customers would be witness to and understand what's possible. That was less about an arbitrary breakdown of, this specific customer for this specific purpose, and it just became something that was much more effective to looking at it in terms of building partnership and facilitating trusted relationships across a wider swath of government, academia, research, and so on, as I said before, than had been possible earlier. So it's the way in which you organize yourselves and the manner in which you change your business practices and behaviors to overcome some of the institutional challenges that, I've heard them called stovepipes of excellence, which you're very satisfied inside of your stovepipe that you've got this effort underway and that you know what you're doing. The problem is that it doesn't integrate when it comes to the field because you haven't actually pre-assessed the requirement for that integration because it wasn't part of your job. And so it sounds pretty wonky, but it's in the way that you approach your efforts and, keeping the premium on teamwork and partnership and trusted relationships first before you start to do your work.
So you've served on boards, across cybersecurity, data, defense-focused companies. From your vantage point, how should organizations think about strategic risk in an era of, lots of cyber threats, AI disruption, and geopolitical competition that may be different than what they were seeing, 5, 10 years ago?
Yeah, I think, some of my involvements today around whether it's uh, boards that are more advisory in nature, working with leadership teams, or certainly with boards of directors. The day in, day out of running a business and worrying about, sort of shareholder equities, bottom line performance, winning work and keeping work, and just the day in, day out grind of running the business profitably tends to work against looking out over the horizon and trying to see around corners. And so this is a role that, whether it's advisory in nature or board directorships, the board is responsible for. That's really where they are, can be instructive to the company's leadership teams around where are the substantive risk. So, for example, the associated, cybersecurity concerns that may have been wished away in the day-to-day operations of the company, but recognizing that a wholesale change is coming with AI, and sort of adversaries that are going to be working at scale using AI for nefarious purposes is, really makes current efforts inadequate. not just for the company itself, but for the customer base that you serve. And so having a meaningful set of discussions and a strategy to action roadmap that all take you in the direction of, sort of better solutions that account for, the coming tidal wave of artificial intelligence and not always for, good purposes is something that, an advisory board or a board of directors might be the first to see coming and to be able to pull everybody's head out of the day-to-day and look strategically for where are the imperative risk to the company's, operations in the future. Similarly, on the opportunity side, not just the challenges, but on the opportunity side, how are we going to leverage, data as a strategic asset that I think people increasingly understand, and manage it in a way that is, in a very practical way, possible because, some of the efforts around large scale data is, whether you're talking in a cloud environment that's dependent on the proliferation of data centers and, just get me another, flash array drive and, just try to keep up with the tidal wave of data, which is an unsustainable model. It's not affordable. It's not really practical to think from a perspective of the energy drain and all of that. So we have to think strategically, how are we going to remain competitive in an environment that today's approach to whether it's data storage and data management or sort of AI for both defensive purposes, but also for following through on business opportunities. How is all of that going to happen? So these are the kinds of conversations as a board that you find yourself in, and I found them uh, both rewarding from a perspective of, you get to do some of what you were doing later on in your career, which is thinking enterprise, thinking large scale, uh, trying to take a holistic approach across a very complex environment and helping leadership teams navigate, sort of the day-to-day challenges, but also the ones out over the horizon in a way that they're just not able to do, without that influence because, they're just trying to keep the lights on and remain competitive in their business.
Well, there's a great point. Um, I'm particularly interested kind of in the data because I think, for a lot of the listeners, they generate a lot of data, whether they're aware of it or not, and they're seeing data centers being built, but that's kind of the extent to what most people know about data. Um, can you tell us kind of what trends you're tracking, maybe related to data or in the realm of cybersecurity, as far as kind of that, that pilot's view, that 30,000 foot. The
Yeah.
rest of us are just generating information like crazy. But in your perspective, how does that impact the big picture?
Yeah, well, it's a great question, and I'll sort of caveat everything going all the way back to earlier in our discussion, Hannah, where I'm not a technologist, but I, have been in this space now for quite some time, between the Air Force and in industry, and now even in different roles that I hold supporting different technology companies, and so. I live in Northern Virginia, and when I drive out towards the Dulles area and beyond that, the entire skyline is filled with data centers and all kinds of cranes, and they're building more. And I read in the paper around the challenges associated with the energy drain from the, I don't know if it's the tri-state region or maybe three or four states anyhow that are having their power grids pulled into Northern Virginia in order to run these, energy demand centers around space, power, and cooling. And not only is it not aesthetically, appealing, it's also got some real concerns for the people who live in those areas. And, certainly for, the challenged power grids, not just in the Northeast, but really all across the country, and the resource drains that it means. So I guess you asked about a trend. One of the trends that I'm very involved in and very interested in is one that uh, works in partnership with these data centers to be much more efficient around the energy drain and the, sort of the positioning of servers inside of the data centers that are already built to be much more efficient, so that space, power, and cooling is not, just more, more, more. It becomes a more efficient use of what you've already committed to, in a way that there are, data storage as a service offerings that would bring, probably 90% of the government a way to be serviced with what their needs are, cloud and on-prem, in a less than, sort of classified environment on one hand, or even a classified high-end, sort of CMMC compliant environment, if that's what's required, using much better, much more cost affordable, much more evolutionary ways of data storage that doesn't have to be this build another data center, bring in another server of flash array drives at the tremendous cost and so on and so forth, like just growing exponentially instead of a better business process and model that can actually keep up with the growth of these large scale data centers. And so working collaboratively between, some of the local data centers and some of the providers of data storage and data management to actually think differently about that problem, to live within your means and still get everybody, what they need in terms of AI and better, sort of business opportunities going forward. Similarly, if you look out over the horizon with cybersecurity, um, quantum is coming, and it's actually not that far away. I think the first time we may have talked about quantum, at least in my world, was, 7 to 10 years from now. Well, now that's 1 to 2 years from now. And it jeopardizes much of our national security infrastructure, not just in cryptography, but in cyber attacks and defending, our enterprise in the way that we've become accustomed. And so we have to think new and novel ideas around how to get quantum resiliency. And so a lot of the work I'm doing for a couple of different companies has, simplified that down to, there are mechanisms to isolate your data so that it's not necessarily subject to even a quantum, security concern, because it's not seen. And so these, novel efforts around quantum resiliency, including, quantum chip development so that we can build and defend our own, sort of infrastructure with quantum secure chips. All of these are different endeavors I'm involved in, typically at new starts, but it's all with the recognition of, let's not look backwards, let's look forward and try to prepare for the future that is coming. Whether it's large scale, data concerns or cybersecurity concerns brought on by quantum, or even, fully out taking advantage of opportunities around data as a strategic asset, those types of efforts. I hope that touches a little bit on on your question there.
Yeah, that's an excellent approach you outlined for tackling some very very present and very complicated cyber challenges that I think a lot of people are starting to face and wonder about. So thank you for that. Do you have any final advice or parting thoughts for the audience today, General Bender?
Well, I think, Hannah, first of all, thank you again for the opportunity to, just sort of field some of your open-ended questions. And I hope some of the, maybe executive level leadership lessons learned, leaked through in some of the ways that I answered because, um, there are no straightforward answers in this complex and uncertain environment that we have, but through good, solid leadership, through a focus on, teaming and partnership and relationships, trusted relationships, I think that, good people, good teams are more than capable to overcome the challenges that the environment today uh, presents. I was very fortunate to be a part of that within the context of, senior leadership positions, whether they were operational or as the CIO of the Air Force, and then again in industry as an executive. And I'm supremely confident of the ability of our government and our industry partners to, navigate the uncertainties of the environment that's out there in front of them today and out over the horizon going forward. But it will take a focus on, teamwork and partnership more than it ever has before. So my number one takeaway, if it would be in terms of advice, is find a way to inspire partnership between industry, government, academia that will stand the test of time. So that might be convening authorities. Some of our, trade associations and nonprofits today may, want to think through the possibility of becoming convening authorities for some of these very complex, challenging across organization challenges and just bring many voices and, a single set of solutions after all voices have been heard to in partnership with industry to try to develop better solutions going forward. And then I think forums like this, in terms of just educating ourselves in an uncertain world, is could not be more important. So, it's sometimes hard uh, to find and to center yourself on reputable sources of information, but it's critically important to stay abreast of the technology as that gets developed, but also the different advancements that are being made in the areas that I talked about, whether it's business models or governance or even, partnership building. So, those two thoughts maybe to leave with your audience, I think are where my mind is today in the roles that I play in helping leadership teams and businesses try to navigate the challenging environment that they find themselves in.
Well, thank you so much for coming on the podcast and sharing your insights, your experiences. I know your contributions to our nation and also, the world have impacted so many. And for that, we are very, very grateful, General Bender.
You're most welcome. Thank you for having me again. And I really enjoyed the conversation. Again, the fact that you weren't too pressing on my technology limitations, I will thank you forever for being kind about that. So thank you.
Well, and to our listeners, thank you for tuning in to this episode of Tipping Spears with Hannah Becker. I hope this conversation has sparked new ideas and challenged the way you think about our future. Don't forget to subscribe to the podcast, and we'll catch you next time with another exciting guest.